It's recording. Good.
All right. Hello. My name is Marques Flowers. I'm a social worker at Memorial High School. And today we will be talking about building a culturally relevant behavior system in your Pacific program. Now, when we think about behavior, we're going to start with a framework called Positive Behavior Supports. PBIS is what is known as nationally. In the Madison schools, we call it Positive Behavior Supports. And it's a framework that is used across the nation. It came out of the University of Oregon and research that they had done on behavior and behavior systems within schools. There are 5 main components of a positive behavior system. Those main components are data, behavior expectations, teaching expectations, acknowledged success, and intervention and discipline. And together, these form a continuous loop that, as a program, school, entity, you will go through as you examine how you're teaching, disciplining, acknowledging students' behavior until you get to the desired results. So as we go through, this is a condensed version of a larger conversation. This is a topic that we could spend 4 hours discussing, and we have in district trainings. But we're going to try and condense it down into the main points so that they may fit, I can give you guys what may fit best with your for your particular organization. So we have proactive classroom management. With proactive classroom management, we want you to be thinking about how can I address issues before they arise. There are certain things as an educator you know you're going to experience. As a coach, to bring in an athletics perspective, you know you're going to experience from an athlete you're working with or a student you're teaching. We're all teaching, the discipline that we're teaching is different, though, whether it be sports, golf, basketball, or math and language arts. We're still trying to impart new knowledge upon a student, a learner. And so with that, you want to have 3 to 5 classroom rules reviewed and posted, 3 to 5 expectations. You want to make sure your expectations are stated clearly. You also may want to have attention signal, an attention getting signal that you use, whether it's a call and response, whether you call out something and the students respond back to show you that they're paying attention and that they're listening and attentive. Clear structures and routines in place. Again, every good teacher, every good coach has some things that their players, their students can expect. When they go into practice, when they go into a learning environment, they can expect that these things are going to happen. This is how we're going to go about our business, and this is how our practice routine goes. Behaviors taught, modeled, and practiced. This is where we get into the teaching of behavior. Sometimes we forget that we're holding sometimes students accountable for things that we haven't explicitly taught them and clearly stated. So that's something that's very important. And then you want to have a 4-to-1 ratio of positives. We want to give positive feedback. We want to let students know when they're doing things appropriately, and also correct them when they're doing things wrong. Both strains of feedback are very important, but we want to make sure we're giving more positive feedback and letting kids know when they are doing things right, rather than giving them continuous negative feedback. Because that just, as a human being, when someone's giving you constant negative feedback, that wears on you. And we can't expect that to be any different in our learners. And then lastly, there has to be time given for relationship and community building. And again, good teachers, good coaches, we all know this. In coaching, you have to have time for your team to come together, become a unit, feel good about working together, feel good about being around each other, feel like they have a relationship with one another that goes beyond just performing at a high level in that particular sport or practicing together. Same thing in the classroom. If kids are going to learn, struggle, have success, face adversity together, there has to be a relationship that bonds them together where they feel comfortable, where they feel safe, stretching themselves and stepping outside of their own comfort zone towards the goal of their own personal achievement, but also the goal of the entire classroom or team's achievement. 3 P's of the 3 P's approach. When we're thinking about a proactive classroom, we have the 3 P's approach. Again, the thoughts and ideas that I'm going to be using with you guys are not my own. They're the ideas of others. This particular idea comes from Dr. Shiraki Holly. He has a book called Culturally and Linguistically Responsive Teaching and Learning. It is a great tool for anyone who wants to kind of expand their knowledge base around how to reach kids across cultures. And again, when we talk about culture, every person on the planet has a culture. So, you know, oftentimes in the context of the United States, we think of culture, we think of African American kids, we think of Latino kids, but culture is something that we all carry with us. And coming from a perspective of understanding how culture interacts with learning is going to allow you to work with kids across backgrounds. And also be very important as a coach, as a teacher, to be able to reach kids regardless of where they come from. Everyone has a culture, and when you're cognizant of how that culture plays into how they learn, it's going to allow you to be more effective. So the 3 P's approach: positive, proactive, and preventative. We want to be positive, showing love to our students for who they are. Again, acknowledging every kid comes with something. Every learner comes with some gifts. They also come with some challenges. What we want to do as instructors, coaches, and teachers is make sure those challenges don't become weaknesses. We want to make sure that they are able to understand their challenges, mitigate those challenges, but we also want to make sure that they come away understanding what their gifts are. You know, I'm also a girls basketball coach here at Memorial High School, and for me it's very important that I explicitly communicate to my players the things that I want them to do, the things that I think they'll excel at, the things that I think they're good at, so that when they go on the court, they know where they're strong and they can play towards their strengths. We want our kids to get the same thing when we're working in a classroom environment or any learning setting where we're teaching them a new skill. We want them also to feel like they understand not only areas where they need to improve, but they also have a good understanding of where they're strong, so that when they get into competition, when they get faced with a new challenge, they have something that they feel they can fall back on, and they can also recognize when a challenge is something that they can overcome, because they know how they can use their strength to maneuver and navigate that particular challenge. We want to be proactive. We want to try and get ahead of the classroom management curve. We want to make sure we're thinking about potential issues before they arise. Again, as coaches and teachers, there are going to be situations where you can kind of see things beginning to take place or take shape or take form. You want to step in early and try and be proactive about reading those situations, but then also responding to those situations when you see things arise. And then you want to be preventative. If we can predict it, we can prevent it. So we want to also be thinking about how can we prevent potential issues. How can we, prevent those challenges from becoming weaknesses. So when we know that there are challenges that students struggle with, when we know there are challenges that learners struggle with, athletes may struggle with, we want to try and find a way to put them in the best position possible to be successful, where their weaknesses or their challenges don't become a weakness in competition. Behavior expectations are a part of the loop or cycle of positive behavior supports. Again, 3 positively stated expectations. The expectations should be very clearly and concisely stated. No more than 3 to 5 words. And the expectations should use language that can be understood by the students, athletes, learners. You want to make sure you're using things that will resonate with them, something that they'll remember, something that they should be able to kind of take and own. It's always best to be able to ask, you should be able to ask any student that you're working with, any player, athlete, student that you're working with, what are our 3 expectations? What are our 3 main objectives? What is it that we expect of each of you on a daily basis? And they should be able to give that back to you. If all of your students can do that, then you have effectively allowed those expectations to take root, and the students are beginning to own them, and it's becoming a part of who they are as learners. Some examples of behavior expectations: be ready, be respectful, be responsible. Again, very clear and concise. They're big picture ideas that can be boiled down to very specific situations. So when we begin to break those down, we use a tool called the behavior matrix. This is a tool where you take your expectations and then you overlay them into different environments. So you have the environment here on the left, and then on the right, you have the different expectations. So for be ready, what does it mean to be ready in the classroom? It means you're going to be on time with your materials. Again, you're explicitly laying out to your students, to the learners, what it means to be ready. So for example, in my basketball practice, I use this same kind of a framework with my players. To be ready means when the buzzer goes off on our clock, you're on the baseline with your shirt tucked in, ready to listen and get practice started. And our players know that. And so that's the expectation. Then in the halls, moving at a respectable pace in the cafeteria, return on time from lunch. Those are kind of things that you would see as you go through these different environments, overlaid as you go through and fill out your behavior matrix. Thinking about the different environments where you'll be working with students and what your expectations will look like in those different environments and how you want to articulate things that you feel like are important for your students to know and be successful in those particular environments. And also, it's also good to give them some input and help you create these expectations that they're going to be held to. Again, it creates that sense of ownership. It creates a sense of agency, of power and control amongst the students, your athletes, your players, that they feel like they're contributing to the expectations that they're going to be held to, and they're more likely to follow them because they help create them. So again, this just kind of summarizes what a behavior matrix is, a tool that communicates expectations across multiple environments. So you develop your expectations and then you put them into a behavior matrix that will then kind of, in more detail, outline across the different environments that may exist where you work with students, what those expectations will look like. Then there's the teaching behavior. As you go through the positive behavior supports loop, you go from establishing expectations to now how do we teach these expectations? Because again, you can't hold students or athletes accountable for things you haven't taught them. I'm not going to expect a young lady to be able to make 9 out of 10 free throws if I haven't taken some time and worked with her on her free throw shooting. That'd be unfair. It's the same thing with any other type of skill that you want to teach someone. It's important that if you're going to hold them accountable for it, they've been taught it. And so teaching behaviors need to be explicitly taught and retaught. So again, as coaches, especially as a coach, you understand that in order for a player to master a skill and to become subconsciously competent at doing something, they have to do it over and over and over. And there's going to be teaching, and then there's going to be reteaching and refining, and that's a part of the process of learning something. Learning new behaviors is the same thing as learning a new skill. If I wanted to teach a new dribble move to a player, I can't just teach it to him, step back, and expect him to be able to execute it at game speed under pressure with a defender on him. They're going to need repetition after repetition after repetition before that particular skill becomes something that they can do instinctively and subconsciously. And so what you want to do is develop a system within the framework of how you're working with students that allows the space for teaching behaviors, but also a space to reteach and revisit behaviors as you continue to go. And that's where routines come into play. Having a routine to start, whether it be a way you teach students to enter the space, whether it be a way in which you teach students to, you guys are teaching golf, to put their golf clubs away, or how to get their golf clubs out. Teaching them that process in which they prepare for whatever teaching is going to take place. That's where you can then have a space for where you're talking about and using language around specific behaviors that you want to see. So are we ready? Are we being respectful? Putting our golf clubs a certain kind of way. Whatever etiquette you want to teach them about the game, that's a great place to do that. But having routines where you revisit those things on a daily basis, that's what makes it become ingrained. That's where kids learn a routine, they learn the process. They learn old behaviors that have already been taught, but also new behaviors can be introduced through that particular routines and structures that already exist as you begin to develop kind of culture around how you want to do things in your particular organization or your environment with students. And then acknowledging. This is where oftentimes people get stuck. I think from an athlete, at least in the educational field, coming from an athletics perspective, I think coaches and athletes understand this more so than oftentimes folks in educational fields understand. All people need feedback. It's good to get feedback when you fail to meet expectations, but it's also just as important, and maybe even more important, that you get feedback when you've done things the right way. That feedback may be more important because as a coach, that's what you want more of. You can tell someone not to do something, which is more important to tell them what to do. And so that positive feedback is telling them what you want to see them do. If you can articulate that, you're going to get better results instead of saying, don't do this, don't do that. So when you're developing your expectations, make sure those expectations are stated positively. And when we say positively, I want you to do this. I want you to do that. Be this, be that. That's how your expectations should be stated so that you're giving kids that feedback of what you want them to do as opposed to what you don't want them to do. Intervention and discipline. So when students are not meeting the behaviors, the expected behaviors, how do we respond? Understanding we are looking not to punish, but to change a behavior and teach a new skill. So we don't want to punish students, because punishment, there's nothing that's learned from punishment, other than what not to do. Instead, we want to teach students a new skill. So in my practices, when I'm working with students, when I'm working with student athletes, when things aren't going the right way, I could put them on the line and make them run. But one, I'm wasting time in my practice. Two, they're getting more and more fatigued, which is probably going to mean once we start to get back into our work, they're going to perform at an even worse level because now they're tired. And then two, it doesn't mean that they're learning a new skill. Instead, we'll backtrack, go back to what we were doing before we started that particular drill, or we were playing 5-on-5. We'll go back, revisit that skill, reteach that skill, and then jump back into work and see if they can apply it at a faster pace and a faster speed. Because in the end, what's more important to me is that they learn the skill, not necessarily that I give them a punishment and they respect my authority, but more so, as a teacher, I want to make sure they learn the skill that I'm trying to teach them in that particular situation, in that given setting. So you want to make sure that you have some systems in place that when things don't go well, students understand how you're going to address it. And then from there, there's a clear expectation of how it's going to be fixed and addressed. And oftentimes that may mean mending a relationship. Again, as a coach, there may be times where you get on an athlete intensely and you're in their face and you're trying to motivate them, you're trying to push them, but you're yelling. And that may take, some athletes don't respond well to that. What that may mean is that later on in that particular practice, that particular coaching session, you may need to step and find some time to revisit that particular relationship with that player, and in a different way, kind of communicate what your expectations are, what you want them to do, how you want them to work, how you want them to respond. And so that's just as important as well in a classroom or any kind of environment where you're teaching new skills, is that there has to be, what I like to say, some sugar with the vinegar. There are going to be times where you got to push kids, you got to push kids to develop a new skill. Then there's also time to step back and help them understand why. Why are you being pushed? Why were you being disciplined in that situation? Why do you have to go through this particular intervention? So that they understand, if I'm going to have kids, work on a blockout drill for 5 extra minutes than we had set aside for, I want them to understand why they're doing 5 extra minutes of blocking out. It's not because I don't like them. It's not because I want to be mean. It's not because I don't like the shoes that they're wearing, or I have an attitude. It's because I don't feel like they've learned the particular skill that I want them to learn, and so we're going to get some extra reps at it. It's the same way with correcting and teaching new behaviors. If a student is being talkative while someone else is talking, yes, it's important that they get a consequence, but that consequence should be related to teaching them how not to talk. Or when they come back, they need to understand why they were asked to step aside or step off the line or step out of the activity for a moment to regroup and regather themselves. They need to understand that because, again, when you think about adolescent development, oftentimes they will interpret that as, well, you did that because you don't like me. And the way I always reframe that for kids is, I didn't do that because I don't like you. I just did that. I did that because I can't teach with you talking, or I don't like you talking while someone else is talking, and you wouldn't like someone else talking while you're talking. So relating it back to not the behavior and not the child, not the learner, not the athlete, is really a really important skill to remember when you're working with kids. And then when you're thinking about how you're going to consequence, the 3 R's of logical consequence. Make sure the consequences are respectful. Again, focus on the behavior and not the student's character. You're not punishing a student. You're teaching a student. You're trying to retrain a student. You're trying to teach a student a new skill or new behavior. You want to make sure it's relevant. It should relate to the student's actions. Again, so if there's a particular action or particular skill that you want to see, then that consequence should be related to that or help bolster that or help teach that particular skill. And then realistic. It's got to be something that can actually be done or performed by the particular student, learner, or athlete. Now, we're going to start to go into culture and thinking about how culture plays into how students, athletes, kids, adults learn and engage with one another. Building a culturally responsive environment. And culturally responsive is a term that is used to describe how we create an environment that, instead of reacting, is interacting with culture, is interactive with culture. It infuses culture into how we operate and how we work together. And again, it takes the idea of culture beyond the context of African American, Latino, European American. Everyone has a culture. And so when you're thinking about any learning environment, any team environment, any coaching environment, there's a culture. And you'll hear professional coaches, college coaches talk about the culture in which the culture of their organization, the culture of their team, the culture of their school, and how that plays into how they work with students and the successes they have or the lack of success. Sometimes there's a toxic culture. Some cultures are more advantageous in athletics. And so when you're thinking about a culturally responsive environment, you want to think about culture of kids from an ethnic standpoint. You want to think about culture from an age standpoint. There's youth culture. And then you also want to think about culture from a sports-specific standpoint. There are certain things that on a golf course you're not gonna that you would do on a basketball court that you can't do on a golf course. There are certain things that you can do on a football field you can't do on a basketball court. There's certain things you can do on a hockey rink that you can't do on a tennis court. And so there's a certain culture that each sport has. And so acclimating that and helping kids become a part of that culture while bringing their own culture in, both their ethnic background, but then also this youth culture into it. You have this pot where you're trying to create an environment where everyone can be successful, given all of these little cultural lenses that they may be looking through on a daily basis. One of our coaches here, Steve Collins, he's a great, our boys basketball program here at Memorial is one of the best in the state. They've won 3 straight championships, been to 7 state championship finals, and he is great at bringing technology into his practices and using technology with his players, and it's something that resonates with the kids because that's a part of youth culture. So that's an example of how do you bring culture into what you're doing with kids and what you're teaching with kids, and it draws connection to them. So again, at the top of it is building relationships. Relationships are key, and again, as coaches, as teachers, you know that. The better relationship you have with a student, with a learner, with an athlete, the harder you can push them, the further you can push them outside of their comfort zone, the more willing they will be to struggle with you as a support, because they know that you're going to support them through it. You're not going to let them fail. You're going to work with them until they get it. All those things are really important towards learning new skills, being successful. Relationship is very key. And then engaging. You want to make sure that whatever it is you're teaching, whatever it is they're learning, they're engaged in it. They feel like they're excited about it. There's an enthusiasm to it. You want to make sure that students are engaged. And then you want to also develop an identity. Again, that's where some of that sports-specific stuff comes in. You know, giving them examples of people who are like them, who they may play like, who they may, swing the club like. Giving them examples where they can project themselves upon and see what the possibilities of what they can become. It's really important because it helps them begin to develop an identity as a learner, as an athlete, where they can see themselves beyond, I always joke with young players that, especially in basketball, and I'm sure golf is the same way. In basketball is a sport that before you can look cool doing it, you got to go through this ugly duckling phase where you're going to look awkward, you're going to dribble the ball off your foot, your shots aren't going to go in, you're going to airball some shots. But after a while, after you keep working, then the pretty jump shot comes, then the yo-yo handles come, and the great defense comes. And I'm sure with golf it's the same way. You're going to shank some shots before you can develop a really smooth stroke and a really smooth swing. And so showing kids the end result where they can get to before they get there keeps them engaged. It keeps them going, and it also helps them develop an identity around being a golfer, being a basketball player, being a student, being a mathematician, being a writer. All those things are really important. And then learning that is meaning making. So again, helping them understand the why that they're doing and learning the things that they're learning. Again, providing them a big picture. Unfortunately, with adolescents, sometimes they can't see but 5 minutes in front of them. They don't have this big picture understanding of how it all comes into play and how it all fits. And so we have to paint that picture for them. We have to kind of fill in the blanks around their narrow kind of pinpoint, me, I, this particular moment, this particular skill is hard for me, it's a challenge, I don't want to do it anymore, I want to give up. But helping them understand the big picture and giving meaning to the work that they're doing, helping them understand that with the repetitions, with the practice, the skill will get sharper and sharper and sharper, but it'll only get sharper if they continue to keep working at it. And they have to commit to that. So helping them find meaning in the work that they're doing. And then continually analyze their achievements. So again, in athletics, this is really easy for us. This is something we do all the time. We set goals. We monitor how close we get to those goals, and if we don't reach the goal, we look at the progress that we made from where we started. We have reams and reams of statistics across all the different sports that we use to quantify how we're performing, how we're doing. That is excellent, and that's something that needs to happen in any classroom setting. Students need to be constantly looking at, I hit the ball 200 yards today, I want to see if I can get it to 220 by the end of the week. And helping them work to begin to figure out what are the things that they need to do to get to that next step, get to that next goal. And when they do, celebrate that achievement. And then move on to the next achievement, move on to the next milestone. Where do we go from here? And then as teachers, coaches, we have to be also very much into who they are. We have to be willing to learn as well around their cultural learning styles. How do I, as a coach, work with 16 and 17-year-old girls? That's a world that I'm not familiar with. I come from a family of boys, all boys, 5 boys, no sisters, just my mom. So I have no natural experience with teenage girls. I didn't live with one, wasn't raised with one. So I have to do a lot of work around understanding their world, their perspective, where they're coming from that lens, but then also, again, the cultural things that the students bring into them that comes from, their family's ethnic background or the neighborhood that they live in, or just they're not from the Midwest. They just moved here from the East Coast. What does that mean? What does that mean for them as an athlete? And how can I reach them? How can I connect with them? How can I make those experiences be beneficial to them in this new environment, this new setting? as you begin to think about that culture, you have to think about culture in general, and what gifts kids bring with them, and how that can play into their ability to learn new skills, access new skills. There's kind of these are kind of a continuum of cultural precepts. And again, this is work that has been done by others. This is not necessarily my particular material. This one is I borrowed from Andrell Davis. She was a teacher in the Madison schools for about 25 years. She currently works with DPI doing culturally responsive work throughout the state. And these are some precepts that she has developed over time as she's done research on culture, particularly African American culture. But all cultures have elements of this within their culture. When you talk about spirituality, resilience, humanism, communalism, orality and verbal expression, personal style and uniqueness, realness, emotional vitality, musicality, and rhythm. Now, the bars may go up and down as you move across different cultures, and how much spirituality exists in a culture may vary from culture to culture, but there's some concept of spirituality throughout every culture. How much personal style and uniqueness may vary and change as you go through different cultures, but every culture has some level of personal style and uniqueness woven into that cultural fabric. So these are things that you want to think about when, again, you're working with young people. Again, I grew up in the 90s, a fan, young basketball player, fan of the Fab Five from the University of Michigan. And so the Fab Five brought in sagging your shorts, the black socks, the bald heads. Now I don't have a choice but to have a bald head, but back then that was a stylistic thing. And so as a youngster, that was a part of how I engaged with basketball, was through my own personal style, having my own personal style about how I was going to dress and have my socks, what shoes I wore, how many wristbands I had on. Those kind of things are important to allow those things to kind of come out. Football players celebrate and dance after touchdown. Some guys hand the ref the ball. Some guys want to dance. Again, depending upon their cultural orientation may determine, how they express themselves. And what we want to do is allow room for those expressions to happen and channel them in appropriate ways within the context of your given sport, your given classroom, the given activity, but we want to allow for some space for those things that kids naturally bring to come out. Some of the most entertaining, some of the most fun athletes to watch have very unique style, very unique quirks that they learn through very untraditional ways. And we don't want to curb that. Because again, that's where the genius of athleticism comes out. And you see athletes doing amazing things that you can't teach. And all coaches can identify those things in every sport. There's some things that you just can't teach. And this is where those things come from. When you're thinking about kids and athletes, this is where the stuff that you can't teach comes from. It comes from those cultural things and those experiences that kids have that you can't package up, and as a coach, you can't replicate. But it makes every athlete unique and special in their own way, and every student unique and special in their own way. So you want to find ways in which you can take that, hone it, sharpen it, refine it, but still let it be, let that particular athlete or student be who they are. And then ultimately, in the end, when we're thinking about culture, we want to validate, affirm, build, and bridge. And again, this is a concept from Dr. Shiraki Holly. We want to validate. Again, we want to figure out what our kids' strengths are, what the athlete's strengths are. We want to affirm. We want to make sure they understand how those skills help them, can be useful to them. But then we want to build. We want to teach new skills. So we want to take what they have, recognize what they have, help them understand how that can help them be successful, and then from there, use that as a springboard to begin to layer new skills on top of it so that we bridge them to where we want them to be. So we want to validate, affirm, build, and bridge. That's what coaching is. That's what teaching is taking where kids are and what kids bring naturally, helping them figure out how that allows them to be successful, and then using that as a platform and foundation to build new skills so that they can get to where we need to be and they're performing at a high level. So here are some reflective questions that you as an organization want to be thinking about as you're beginning to think about how do we build our system around behavior and culture, and how do we put all this together for our learners, our athletes, our students. You want to ask yourself the question, do we have clearly stated expectations? Do students know what we expect of them? Do our students, our athletes, know what it is that we expect? Do we teach those expectations? So are we finding time to teach and reteach our expectations just as we would a free throw shot, just as we would a golf swing? You want to make sure that with behavior you're reteaching and teaching consistently. Do we acknowledge kids who meet our expectations? So again, if there's an expectation that you've set, when a student is meeting that expectation, how do you systemically have a place where you acknowledge that? The example I like to use again, bringing in athletics, because again, I think in athletics we do a great job of acknowledging little small victories. It's college football season, and you'll see a lot of college football teams have helmet stickers. When guys make a good block, when they are in the right place at the right time, when they fill the gap correctly, they get a little sticker on their helmet. It's not a big deal. As someone on the outside looking in, you kind of don't know what they got it for, but you know they've done it a lot of times if they have a lot of stickers. And so those small things, those small ways, it doesn't have to be something major, it doesn't have to be something extravagant, but those small ways in which you're acknowledging on a day-to-day basis, you're giving that positive feedback that your learners, your athletes, your students are doing things the right way. And then you have a system to address misbehaviors. So if there are things that are happening that aren't meeting the expectations, you have a system that's in place to address it. The way you address it is relevant. It's respectful to the particular student. It's respectful to the person or, the person who may have been offended. It's also realistic. It's something that can happen and can be done and that they're capable of doing. And it's related to the new teaching that's going to happen through that particular intervention, through that particular consequence, is going to be related to the expectation violation that took place. Another question to ask yourself is, do we link our students' culture to new skills? That's where the validate, affirm, build, and bridge comes into play. Are we taking where our kids are and the culture that they're bringing, and are we helping them move and figure out how to use that culture to their advantage, and then teaching them new skills on top of that? And then can we recognize the difference between a cultural behavior and a misbehavior? So something that's cultural, again, a flag may be thrown for a guy dancing in the end zone after a touchdown, but in the end, that's probably something that's more of a cultural behavior rather than something that should be penalized. If it becomes excessive, of course, throw a flag, 15 yards. But otherwise, we want to make sure that we're able to recognize when students are bringing their culture to the table and when students are simply doing something that just doesn't work in our environment. And that's going to be a line that you as an organization have to draw. The key is to have that internal conversation before throwing consequences and penalties at students, athletes, or learners. And you may come to the conclusion, yes, it is a misbehavior, and that's totally fine. But the key element of it is to have that conversation. If you're having that conversation, you're doing the necessary work you need to take culture into account and understand how culture plays into who your students are and how they learn. So again, that one gets a little tricky because people kind of get caught up on, well, what if I'm right or what if I'm wrong? It's not about being right or wrong, it's about the process. It's about the process of investigation, of thinking about culture and how it relates to how kids respond, how kids interact, how kids show respect, how kids show disrespect. It's just going through that thought process and thinking about that's really important. So that'll conclude this. Again, it's a lot more interactive when it's done in person, but I'm very thankful for the opportunity to share this knowledge, and hopefully I have an opportunity to meet you guys in person.